I watched my grandson Marcus load the last of his belongings into my pristine 1967 Mustang convertible, the cherry red paint gleaming in the afternoon sun like it had the day my late husband Harold bought it for our 25th anniversary. "Don't worry, Grandma Rose," Marcus said, tossing his duffel bag into the back seat with casual disregard. "We just need to borrow it forever, you know? You don't drive much anymore anyway." His girlfriend Sienna laughed, sliding her perfectly manicured fingers along the dashboard. "It's not like you're using it to go anywhere important." That's when I knew I had to call the police and report my own car stolen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone assumes that at 72 years old, I've lost my edge, that I'm just some sweet old lady who bakes cookies and watches game shows all day. They couldn't be more wrong. My name is Rose Martinez, and I've been taking care of myself and everyone around me since I was 16 years old. I raised 4 children as a single mother after their father decided that family responsibility wasn't for him, built my own successful catering business from scratch, and put every one of my kids through college by working 18-hour days and refusing to accept charity from anyone. Marcus is my eldest daughter Elena's boy, 24 years old and handsome in that reckless way that gets young men into trouble. Dark hair that he never combs properly, his father's brown eyes, and a smile that could charm the paint off a fence when he wanted something, which lately seemed to be all the time. Elena passed away 3 years ago from complications during what should have been routine surgery, leaving Marcus and his younger sister Carmen without their anchor. Carmen had handled the loss by throwing herself into nursing school and working part-time at the hospital. Marcus had handled it by quitting his job at the auto repair shop and deciding that life owed him something easier. The Mustang had been my pride and joy for 47 years. Harold had saved for 2 years to buy it, working overtime at the steel mill and skipping lunches to put aside every extra dollar. "Every woman should have something that makes her feel powerful," he'd said when he handed me the keys. "This car is yours, Rose. Don't let anyone tell you you're too old or too careful to drive something beautiful." After Harold died 8 years ago, that car became more than transportation. It was my connection to him, to the woman I'd been before arthritis made my hands stiff and before my children started treating me like I was made of glass. I still drove it twice a week to the grocery store, once a month to visit Harold's grave, and every Sunday to Mass at St. Catherine's. The engine purred like a contented cat, the leather seats had been lovingly maintained, and despite its age, it ran better than most cars half its age. I'd had it serviced religiously at Gonzalez Auto, where the owner, Miguel, had known Harold and treated the Mustang like a piece of art, rather than just another vehicle. Marcus had been asking about the car for months, ever since his girlfriend Sienna had moved in with him at his cramped apartment downtown. At first, it had been casual comments. "That's such a cool car, Grandma. I bet it gets a lot of attention." Then it became more direct suggestions. "You know, I could take it for a drive sometimes, help keep the engine from getting rusty from sitting too much." Finally, 2 weeks ago, it had become outright requests. "Sienna and I are thinking about taking a road trip to California. Could we borrow the Mustang? It would be so much cooler than renting something." Every time I'd politely declined. The car wasn't a loaner vehicle. It was Harold's last gift to me, and I wasn't comfortable with someone else driving it across the country. Marcus had seemed to accept this, but I should have known better. My grandson had inherited his grandfather's charm, but none of his respect for other people's boundaries. Sienna was a different story entirely. 22 years old with platinum blonde hair that came from a bottle, she had the kind of confidence that comes from being told you're beautiful since childhood, but never being told you need to develop character to go with it. She worked sporadically as a social media influencer, which as far as I could tell meant she took pictures of herself wearing clothes that companies had sent her for free and hoped people would buy the same items. She treated Marcus like an accessory and everyone else like they existed solely to make her life more convenient. The first time Marcus brought her to Sunday dinner 6 months ago, she'd walked into my kitchen, looked around at my carefully maintained 1950s appliances and hand-painted ceramic dishes, and announced, "This is so retro. It's like stepping back in time. You should totally start an Instagram account, Mrs. Martinez. Vintage aesthetics are huge right now."
She'd spent the entire meal taking pictures of her food instead of eating it, posting them with captions about authentic abuela cooking that made my skin crawl. What bothered me most wasn't her superficiality or her casual disrespect. It was the way she looked at my belongings like they were props in her personal show. She'd run her fingers along Harold's antique tools in the garage, pick up my mother's china without asking, and comment on how cute everything was, in a tone that suggested she was humoring an old woman's quaint lifestyle. When she looked at the Mustang, I could practically see dollar signs in her eyes. 3 days ago, Marcus had come by for what I thought was a regular visit. We'd had coffee in the kitchen while he told me about a job interview he had supposedly had at a marketing firm downtown. The story didn't quite add up. The company name changed mid-conversation, and he was vague about what the position actually involved. But he was animated and excited, talking about how this could be his big break, how he and Sienna were planning to move to Los Angeles where the real opportunities are. "The thing is, Grandma," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "we need reliable transportation for the move. You know? Something that won't break down on the highway. Something with character." His fingers had tightened around mine, and I'd felt a chill of recognition. This was how he'd convinced his mother to co-sign for his apartment lease, how he'd talked his sister Carmen into lending him money she couldn't afford to lose. The earnest eye contact, the gentle touch, the implication that you were the only person who could help him achieve his dreams. "Marcus," I said carefully, "if you need help with a security deposit for an apartment or money for moving expenses, we can talk about that, but the car stays here." His face had darkened for just a moment before the charming smile returned. "Of course, Grandma, I would never ask you to give up your car. I just thought maybe we could work something out, like a long-term loan situation." A long-term loan situation. The phrase had stuck with me for 3 days, nagging at the back of my mind like a splinter. This morning, when I'd come back from Mass to find Marcus and Sienna loading boxes into the Mustang like they owned it, that phrase had suddenly made perfect sense. "What's going on here?" I asked, standing in my own driveway with my church purse clutched in my hands. Marcus had straightened up, that familiar guilty expression flickering across his face before being replaced by defensive bravado. "Hey, Grandma, we were going to call you, but we figured it would be easier to just come by and explain in person." "Explain what, exactly?" Sienna had emerged from my garage carrying Harold's old road atlas, the one he'd used to plan all our cross-country trips back when we were young and thought we had all the time in the world. Seeing her hands on something so personal had made my chest tighten with anger. "We're heading out to California today," she announced, like she was doing me a favor by informing me. "Marcus got that job and we need to be there by Wednesday, so we're gonna need the car." "Need the car?" I repeated, my voice staying level through years of practice dealing with difficult customers and unreasonable relatives. "This is my car. I never agreed to let you take it anywhere."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marcus had run his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. "Come on, Grandma, you know we'll take good care of it. And honestly, it's not like you're using it for anything important. You drive it to the store once a week. We're talking about building our future here." That's when Sienna had made her comment about borrowing it forever, and something inside me had snapped into sharp focus. This wasn't about transportation or career opportunities. This was theft, dressed up in family obligations and emotional manipulation. They weren't asking for permission. They were informing me of their decision and expecting me to go along with it because challenging them would be too much trouble for an old woman to handle. "Get your things out of my car," I'd said, my voice carrying the authority I'd used to manage kitchen staff and deal with demanding clients for 30 years. "Right now." Marcus had stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "Grandma, don't be like this. We're family. Family helps each other out." "Family doesn't steal from each other," I'd replied, "and that's what this is. Theft."
Sienna had laughed, actually laughed like the idea of me standing up to them was amusing. "Mrs. Martinez, you're being really dramatic. It's just a car. You can get another one." Just a car. Harold's last gift to me, the symbol of 47 years of marriage and partnership, reduced to just a car by a girl who thought everything in the world existed for her convenience. I'd walked into my house, picked up the phone, and dialed 911. "I need to report a theft in progress," I'd told the dispatcher. "Two people are trying to steal my car from my driveway." Through the kitchen window, I'd watched Marcus and Sienna exchange glances, their confidence beginning to waver as they realized I was serious. The police had arrived within 15 minutes. Two officers, both younger than Marcus, who'd listened patiently as I explained the situation. Marcus had tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was my grandson and we were just having a family disagreement. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez had said to me, "is this your vehicle?" I'd shown him the registration and title, both clearly in my name. "Did you give these individuals permission to take your car?" I'd looked Marcus in the eye when I answered. "No, I did not." Officer Johnson had asked Marcus and Sienna to remove their belongings from the vehicle and step away. "But she's my grandmother," Marcus had protested. "This is ridiculous. Tell them, Grandma. Tell them this is just a misunderstanding." I'd stood there in my Sunday dress, my hands folded in front of me, and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response you can give. Sienna had been furious. "This is insane," she'd snapped at the officers. "She's a lonely old woman who's trying to control her family because she has nothing else going on in her life. This is harassment." Officer Rodriguez remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, the vehicle belongs to Mrs. Martinez. Without her permission, taking it would constitute theft. I suggest you make other transportation arrangements." After they'd loaded their belongings into Sienna's beaten-up Honda Civic and driven away, the officers had asked if I wanted to press charges. I'd considered it for a long moment, standing next to the Mustang and running my hand along the hood Harold had polished every Saturday morning for 20 years. "Not today," I had said finally. "But I want this incident documented in case they try again." As I watched their taillights disappear down my street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Control over my own life and belongings. For too long, I'd let family members treat me like I was becoming invisible, like my opinions and boundaries didn't matter because I was getting older. Today, I'd reminded them and myself that I was still Rose Martinez, the woman who'd built a business from nothing and raised 4 children on her own. But I also felt something else, a nagging worry that this confrontation was just the beginning, not the end. Marcus had looked genuinely shocked when I'd called the police, like the possibility that I might stand up for myself had never occurred to him. That kind of entitlement doesn't disappear overnight. If anything, being publicly embarrassed in front of his girlfriend would probably make him more determined to prove that I couldn't push him around. I spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon sitting in the Mustang, not driving anywhere, just sitting behind the wheel and remembering road trips with Harold. The smell of the leather seats, the way the engine vibrated through the steering wheel, the sense of freedom that came from knowing you could go anywhere you wanted at any time. This car represented more than transportation. It represented independence, memories, and the life I'd built with someone I loved. That evening, my phone started ringing. First, Elena's younger sister, my daughter Patricia, calling to ask what had happened. "Marcus called me crying. He says you had him arrested for trying to borrow your car. Rose, what's gotten into you?" Then Carmen, Marcus's sister, had called from her shift at the hospital. "Grandma Rose, Marcus is really upset. He says you wouldn't even listen to him explain. Can't you guys work this out like adults?" Each conversation had been the same pattern. Family members who hadn't heard my side of the story, who assumed that because I was the oldest person involved, I must be the one being unreasonable. Everyone seemed to think that family meant I should automatically say yes to whatever Marcus wanted, regardless of my own feelings or the value of what he was asking for. Patricia, I'd said during that first call, would you lend someone your car indefinitely without discussing it first? There was a pause. Well, no, but this is different. Marcus's family. And Rose, you have to admit, you don't really need that car for much anymore. The assumption in her voice that my needs were automatically less important because of my age had made me angrier than Marcus's attempted theft. By Monday morning, I'd received 6 phone calls and 12 text messages from various family members, all variations on the same theme. I was being too harsh. Marcus is young and makes mistakes.
Family should stick together. The car was just sitting in my garage most of the time anyway. Wouldn't it be better to see it being used and appreciated? Not one person had asked how I felt about nearly having my most prized possession stolen. Not one person had acknowledged that Marcus and Sienna had been wrong to load their belongings into my car without permission. Instead, I was being painted as the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. Tuesday afternoon, Carmen had come by after her shift at the hospital, still wearing her scrubs and looking exhausted. She'd always been my favorite of Elena's children, practical and hardworking like her mother, without Marcus's sense of entitlement. "Grandma Rose," she'd said, settling into Harold's old recliner, "I need to understand what really happened on Sunday." I'd made us both coffee and told her the whole story, from Marcus's initial requests to borrow the car to finding them loading their belongings without permission. Carmen had listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as I continued. "He told everyone you called the police because he asked to borrow the car," she'd said when I finished. "That's not what happened at all." "No," I'd replied. "It's not." Carmen had been quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "Marcus has been struggling since Mom died," she'd said finally. "I think he's been looking for shortcuts, ways to get ahead without having to work as hard as she did." This was as close as Carmen would come to criticizing her brother, and I'd appreciated her honesty. "I understand grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally do," I'd said, "but taking someone's car without permission isn't grief. It's theft." Carmen had nodded slowly. "You're right, and I'm sorry he put you in that position. But Grandma Rose, he's getting a lot of pressure from Sienna to make this California thing work. She's convinced him that this is their big chance, and she doesn't want to hear about practical concerns like how they're going to afford the move." This had been the first time anyone in the family had suggested that maybe Sienna wasn't the innocent bystander she'd been portraying herself as. "What do you know about this job Marcus supposedly got?" I'd asked. Carmen had shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure there is a job. When I asked him for details, he got defensive and changed the subject. I think Sienna has some kind of plan to make money with her social media stuff, and she's convinced Marcus that it's going to work out if they just get to California." The pieces had started falling into place. This wasn't about career opportunities or building a future. This was about a young woman who'd convinced my grandson that he could shortcut his way to success, and my car was just the first step in funding their fantasy. If I'd let them take the Mustang, what would have been next? Asking to borrow money for apartment deposits they'd never pay back? Moving in with me temporarily while they figured out their next move? "Carmen," I'd said, "I love your brother, but I won't be manipulated into funding his mistakes, and I won't let anyone treat my belongings like their community property just because we share DNA." She'd reached across and squeezed my hand. "I know, Grandma Rose. And for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Maybe it'll be a wake-up call for him." But wake-up calls, I was learning, don't always work the way you hope they will. Wednesday morning, I'd discovered that my troubles with Marcus and Sienna were just beginning. I'd been watering my tomato plants in the backyard when I'd heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the side gate, I'd glimpsed a flash of platinum blonde hair and heard Sienna's voice, sharp with anger. "I can't believe she actually called the cops on us. Who does that to family?" I'd moved closer to the fence, staying out of sight but within earshot. Marcus said, "She's gotten weird since Grandpa Harold died," and the casual dismissal in his voice had made my chest tight.
I think she's lonely and trying to control everyone around her because she can't control getting older. Lonely, controlling, weird. These were the words my grandson was using to describe me to his girlfriend, reducing 47 years of marriage and a lifetime of independence to the rambling of a confused old woman. Sienna said, well, she can't keep the car forever. And honestly, Marcus, if she's going to be this difficult about helping family, maybe it's time to think about other options. Other options. The phrase had sent a chill down my spine. What kind of other options could they be talking about? I'd stayed hidden behind my rose bushes, my heart pounding as I listened to them walk around to my front door. The doorbell had rung 3 times, but I had remained in the backyard, unwilling to face another confrontation. After about 10 minutes, I'd heard Marcus's voice again, closer to the fence. She's probably hiding in there, pretending not to be home. This is ridiculous, Sienna snapped. We need that car, Marcus. My Honda isn't going to make it to California, and we can't afford to rent something for a month. Your grandmother is being selfish, and you need to make her understand that. The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. In her mind, my refusal to hand over my most valuable possession was selfish, but their attempt to take it without permission was perfectly reasonable. They left after another few minutes, but their visit had accomplished something they probably didn't intend. It showed me exactly how they viewed the situation. I wasn't a person with legitimate feelings and boundaries. I was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved. And if I wouldn't cooperate voluntarily, they were prepared to find other ways to get what they wanted. That afternoon, I'd done something I hadn't done in years. I'd called my attorney, David Chen, who'd handled Harold's estate and my business legal needs for the past decade. David, I'd said, I need to talk to you about protecting my assets from family members who think they're entitled to them. He'd listened to the whole story with professional detachment, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. Rose, he said, what you're describing is a classic pattern of elder financial abuse. It often starts with small requests and escalates to outright theft if the victim doesn't establish clear boundaries. Victim. The word stung because it implied helplessness, but I'd recognize the accuracy of it. Marcus and Sienna had been testing my boundaries, seeing how much they could get away with before I pushed back. What are my options? I'd asked. David had outlined several possibilities, from restraining orders to formal estate planning, that would make it impossible for anyone to access my assets without specific legal procedures. The most important thing, he said, is documentation. Keep records of every interaction, every request, every attempt to manipulate or pressure you.
If this escalates, you'll need evidence. Documentation. As I'd hung up the phone, I'd realized that Sunday's police report had been more important than I'd initially understood. It wasn't just about stopping Marcus and Sienna from taking my car. It was about establishing a legal record that they'd been willing to take my property without permission. Thursday had been quiet, no phone calls or unexpected visits. I'd almost started to hope that maybe the confrontation had been enough, that Marcus and Sienna would give up on California and focus on building a life here. But Friday morning had brought a new development that had shown me just how wrong I'd been. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had knocked on my door around 9 o'clock, looking concerned. "Rose," she'd said, "I thought you should know. That young man and woman who were here yesterday, they came back around midnight last night and spent about an hour looking in your garage windows." My blood had run cold. Looking in my garage windows? Mrs. Patterson had nodded grimly. I couldn't sleep, so I was reading in my front room with the lights off. I saw them with a flashlight, trying to see inside your garage. When my motion sensor light came on, they hurried back to their car and left. They'd been scouting my property in the middle of the night, trying to figure out another way to get to the Mustang. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about 2 young people who'd convinced themselves that they deserved something that belonged to me, and they were prepared to escalate their efforts until they got it. I'd thanked Mrs. Patterson and immediately called the police non-emergency line. The officer I'd spoken with had taken my report seriously, especially when I'd mentioned the previous incident. "Ma'am," he'd said, "I'd recommend installing security cameras if you don't already have them. And if you see them on your property again, call 911 immediately." security cameras. At 72 years old, I was having to turn my home into a fortress to protect my belongings from my own grandson. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 40 years, I'd worried about strangers breaking into my house. It had never occurred to me that the threat might come from inside my own family. That afternoon, I'd driven the Mustang to the electronics store and purchased a complete security system. Cameras for the front and back of the house, motion sensors for the garage, and a monitoring system that would alert both me and the police if anyone tried to break in. The young man who'd installed the system had been patient and thorough, explaining how everything worked and showing me how to review footage on my tablet. "Ma'am," he'd said as he'd finished up, "this is a really nice setup. You'll be able to see everything that happens on your property, day or night. Is there some specific security concern we should know about?" I had considered telling him the truth, but explaining that I was protecting myself from my own grandson had seemed too complicated. "Just want to be safe," I'd said instead. That evening, as I'd tested the new cameras and watched the live feed on my tablet, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness that it had come to this, that a family disagreement over a car had escalated to the point where I needed electronic surveillance to feel secure in my own home, but also determination to protect what was mine and to refuse to be victimized by people who thought my age made me an easy target. As I'd sat in Harold's recliner, watching the camera feeds and thinking about everything that had led to this moment, I'd realized something important. This wasn't really about the car at all. The Mustang was just the symbol, the concrete representation of a larger issue. Marcus and Sienna saw me as someone whose opinions didn't matter, whose belongings were available for their use, whose resistance could be worn down through persistence and family guilt. But I was still Rose Martinez, the woman who'd built a successful business and raised 4 children on her own. I wasn't going to become a victim just because some people thought I should be grateful for any attention they were willing to give me. And if Marcus and Sienna wanted to escalate this conflict, they were about to learn that underestimating me had been their first mistake. The weekend was approaching, and I had a feeling that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of my car, but the future of my relationship with my grandson and my sense of security in my own home. I'd drawn a line in the sand on Sunday when I'd called the police. Now I was going to find out whether that line would hold, or whether I'd need to take even more drastic steps to protect myself and everything I'd worked so hard to build. Saturday morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was crystal clear and professional. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Sarah Kim with the Metro Police Department. I understand you've had some recent incidents involving attempted theft of your vehicle?" My grip tightened on the phone. I'd filed the reports, installed the security system, but I hadn't expected the police to follow up so thoroughly. "Yes, that's correct. My grandson and his girlfriend tried to take my car without permission last Sunday." "Ma'am, I'm calling because we've received additional information that suggests this incident might be part of a larger pattern. Would you be available to come down to the station this afternoon to speak with me?" A larger pattern. The words sent ice through my veins. What had Marcus and Sienna gotten themselves involved in? "Of course, Detective. What time would be convenient?" "How about 3 o'clock? And Mrs. Martinez, I'd recommend bringing any documentation you have related to these incidents. Phone records, text messages, anything that might be relevant." After hanging up, I spent 2 hours gathering everything I could find. Screenshots of the hostile text messages from various family members pressuring me to work things out with Marcus. The police report from Sunday, photos of the security system installation receipts, even the old road atlas that Sienna had been carrying, which I'd retrieved from my garage after they'd left. I wasn't sure what any of it proved, but Detective Kim had asked for documentation. The police station was busier than I'd expected for a Saturday afternoon. Detective Kim was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an efficient handshake. She led me to a small conference room and offered me coffee, which I declined. My nerves were already jangled enough. "Mrs. Martinez, let me be direct with you. Your grandson, Marcus Torres, and Sienna Walsh are persons of interest in several ongoing investigations." She opened a thick file folder and pulled out photographs. "Do these look familiar?" The first photo showed Marcus and Sienna standing beside an older man next to a vintage Corvette. The second showed them with a different elderly person beside a classic Camaro.
In both pictures, they looked relaxed and friendly, like they belonged there. I don't understand, I said slowly.
Who are these people? That's what we're trying to figure out. Over the past 8 months, we've received reports from 5 different elderly car collectors in the tri-state area. All of them reported either attempted theft or successful theft of classic vehicles. In every case, the perpetrators were described as a young Hispanic male and a blonde woman in their 20s. My mouth went dry. You think Marcus and Sienna have done this before? Detective Kim pulled out more documents. 3 months ago, a 78-year-old man in Riverside reported his 1965 Thunderbird stolen. He'd been approached by a young couple claiming to be car enthusiasts who wanted to feature his vehicle in a social media campaign about classic cars. They convinced him to let them take promotional photos with the car, then drove off and never returned. The room seemed to tilt around me. Social media campaign. Sienna's supposed influencer career suddenly took on a much more sinister dimension. Was the car ever recovered? Found 2 weeks later in a chop shop in Nevada, already partially dismantled. By the time we tracked it down, it was worthless. She pulled out another file. Then there's the case from last month. An 82-year-old woman in Bakersfield was convinced to lend her 1969 Mustang boss to a young couple who claimed they needed it for a film shoot. Promised her it would be returned within a week, and that she'd be compensated for its use. My hands were shaking now. Another Mustang. Another elderly person trusting young people who seemed charming and legitimate. What happened to her car? We found it abandoned in Los Angeles 3 days later, stripped of everything valuable. Engine, transmission, wheels, even the seats. The frame was all that was left. Detective Kim's expression was grim. Mrs. Martinez, I believe your security cameras and your decision to call the police last Sunday may have saved you from becoming another victim in this pattern. The magnitude of what had almost happened hit me like a physical blow. If I hadn't stood my ground, if I'd let Marcus and Sienna take the Mustang to California, Harold's car would have ended up in pieces in some criminal garage, sold for parts to fund whatever scheme they were really running. How did you connect Marcus and Sienna to these other cases? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Detective Kim showed me a series of photographs taken from security cameras. The Riverside victim had cameras that caught clear images of the perpetrators. The facial recognition software matched your grandson's driver's license photo and Ms. Walsh's social media profiles. Once we had their identities, we started looking for other similar cases. She spread out more documents. Mrs. Martinez, there's something else you need to know. We've been monitoring their social media activities since your initial report. Ms. Walsh has been posting regularly about their upcoming California adventure, and some of her content suggests that they're still actively looking for funding sources. She handed me printouts of Instagram posts, photos of Sienna posing beside luxury cars with captions like, "Vintage vibes for the road trip of a lifetime," and "Sometimes you have to take risks for your dreams." The most recent post from yesterday showed her and Marcus standing beside what looked like an expensive RV rental with the caption, "California dreaming requires California transportation." They rented an RV? I asked, confused. That's what we thought initially, but when we contacted the rental company, they had no record of renting that particular vehicle to either Marcus Torres or Sienna Walsh. We're still investigating how they gained access to it. The implications were staggering. Not only had Marcus and Sienna been targeting elderly car collectors, but they were continuing their criminal activities even after being stopped at my house. The RV was probably stolen, just another vehicle in their growing collection of crimes. Detective Kim, what happens now? Can you arrest them? She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. We have circumstantial evidence linking them to several thefts, but proving intent and conspiracy in court requires more concrete proof. However, your case is different. They were caught on your neighbor's security camera attempting to surveil your property after being warned off by police. That gives us grounds for harassment and stalking charges. But not theft charges for the other victims? Those cases are more complicated. The victims in Riverside and Bakersfield both gave initial permission for the suspects to take their vehicles, even though that permission was obtained through deception. Proving that the deception was intentional rather than miscommunication requires evidence we don't yet have. I felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all. These young people were systematically targeting elderly victims, stealing their most prized possessions, and the law couldn't touch them because they were clever about how they manipulated their victims into cooperation? However, Detective Kim continued, there is something you can do that might help us build stronger cases against them. Are you willing to participate in a controlled operation? What kind of operation? We'd like you to contact Marcus and suggest that you've reconsidered your position about the car. Tell him you feel bad about calling the police and that you want to work out some kind of arrangement. If we can get him to incriminate himself on recorded phone calls or text messages, we'll have the evidence we need for conspiracy charges. The idea of pretending to reconcile with Marcus while secretly recording him made my stomach turn. But thinking about the other victims, about the 82-year-old woman whose Mustang had been stripped for parts, I knew I had to try. What would I need to do? Detective Kim explained the process. They would provide me with recording equipment and specific phrases to use that might prompt Marcus to reveal details about their operation. The goal was to get him to admit that they had targeted me specifically because of my car, and ideally to get him to reference the other thefts they had committed. Mrs. Martinez, I need to be clear about the risks. If Marcus and Sienna realize you're working with law enforcement, they might escalate their harassment of you. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about Harold, about how he'd always told me to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. About the other elderly victims who trusted these criminals and lost treasured possessions. About my own granddaughter Carmen, who's working double shifts to pay her way through nursing school while her brothers schemed to steal from family members. Detective, I've been taking care of myself for longer than Marcus has been alive. If helping you catch these thieves means putting myself at risk, so be it. She smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. I had a feeling you'd say that. Let's talk about the details. The recording equipment was smaller than I'd expected. A tiny device that clipped to my bra strap and was virtually invisible even under thin clothing. Detective Kim showed me how to activate it with a simple touch, how to ensure it was recording properly, and how to position myself to get the clearest audio. Remember, she said as we finished the technical briefing, your goal is to sound like a grandmother who feels guilty about being too harsh. Let Marcus think he's manipulating you into changing your mind. Ask questions that might get him to reveal details about how they've approached other victims or what they plan to do with your car once they got to California. That evening, I sat in Harold's recliner with my phone in my lap, rehearsing what I was going to say. The recording device felt strange against my chest, a constant reminder that I was about to betray my own grandson's trust in order to protect other innocent victims. But every time I wavered, I reminded myself of the stripped Mustang frame in Los Angeles, of the elderly man whose Thunderbird had been destroyed in a chop shop. At 8 o'clock, I took a deep breath and dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. Grandma Rose? Marcus, sweetheart. I've been thinking about what happened last Sunday. I think maybe I overreacted. There was a long pause. You called the police on me, Grandma. That was pretty harsh. I forced myself to sound contrite. I know, honey. I was scared and confused, and I made a bad decision. I've been feeling terrible about it all week. This part wasn't entirely untrue. I had been feeling terrible, just not for the reasons I was implying. Well, Marcus said slowly, I'm glad you called. Sienna and I have been really hurt by the whole thing. We thought we could count on family, you know? That's just it, Marcus. You are family, and families should support each other. Tell me about this job opportunity in California. Maybe we can figure out some way to make the car situation work. His tone immediately brightened. Really, Grandma? You'd consider letting us use the Mustang for the move? I didn't say that exactly, but maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. Help me understand what you need and for how long. What followed was a 20-minute conversation that made my blood run cold. Marcus explained that he and Sienna had developed what he called a business model around classic car photography. They would identify elderly collectors through car show registration lists and social media, then approach them with proposals for photo shoots or promotional campaigns. The thing is, Grandma, most of these old folks are just sitting on these amazing cars, barely driving them. They're excited to have young people show interest, and they usually agree to let us borrow the cars for shoots. It's a win-win situation. What happens after the photo shoots? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Well, that depends. Sometimes the cars are so valuable that it makes more sense to, extend the rental period while we work on getting the maximum promotional value out of them. Extend the rental period. He was describing theft in terms that made it sound like a business strategy. Marcus, that sounds like you're keeping people's cars longer than they agreed to. Grandma, you don't understand how this works. These people have insurance, and honestly, most of them get more value out of the insurance claims than they were getting out of cars that just sat in our garages. We're actually doing them a favor. The casual callousness of his explanation was breathtaking. He'd convinced himself that stealing elderly people's treasured possessions was actually helping them. Insurance fraud was just another business opportunity. What about your plan for my Mustang? Were you planning to use it for photo shoots? Initially, yeah. Sienna has contacts in LA who work with vintage car rental companies for movie productions. A car like yours could probably earn $2,000 or $3,000 a month in rental fees. We figured we'd split the profits with you 50-50 after we got established. Rental fees from stolen vehicles. Movie production companies who thought they were dealing with legitimate car rental businesses. The scope of their criminal operation was far more sophisticated than I had realized. Marcus, sweetheart, this all sounds very complicated. How many other families have you worked with on these kinds of arrangements? Oh, quite a few. Sienna's really good at identifying potential partners through social media. She can spot collector car owners from their posts, figure out who lives alone, who might be interested in making some extra money from their vehicles. Target identification through social media surveillance. They weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were running a systematic criminal enterprise that specifically targeted vulnerable elderly victims. And these partnerships have worked out well for everyone involved? There was a slight pause before Marcus answered. Well, Grandma, sometimes older people get confused about the arrangements or have unrealistic expectations about timing. But overall, yeah, it's been successful. Older people get confused. He was describing the victim's distress at having their car stolen as confusion about business arrangements. The psychological manipulation was as disturbing as the theft. Marcus, sweetheart, this all sounds very complicated. How many other families have you worked with on these kinds of arrangements? Oh, quite a few. Sienna's really good at identifying potential partners through social media. She can spot collector car owners from their posts, figure out who lives alone, who might be interested in making some extra money from their vehicles. Target identification through social media surveillance. They weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were running a systematic criminal enterprise that specifically targeted vulnerable elderly victims. And these partnerships have worked out well for everyone involved? There was a slight pause before Marcus answered. Well, Grandma, sometimes older people get confused about the arrangements or have unrealistic expectations about timing. But overall, yeah, it's been successful. Older people get confused. He was describing the victim's distress at having their car stolen as confusion about business arrangements. The psychological manipulation was as disturbing as the theft. Marcus, I want to help you succeed, but I need to be sure I understand what I would be getting into. Can you give me some examples of how these partnerships have worked with other families? I probably shouldn't get too specific over the phone, Grandma. Business confidentiality, you know. But I can tell you that we've helped several collectors maximize the value of their investments. Maybe when Sienna and I come by tomorrow, we can show you some of the promotional materials we've created. They were planning to come by tomorrow. My heart started racing as I realized this conversation was moving faster than I had expected. Tomorrow might work. What time were you thinking? How about 2 o'clock? We can bring our portfolio and show you exactly how this would benefit everyone involved.
Martinez, that was excellent work. We have Marcus on recording discussing target identification, insurance fraud, and theft described as extended rental periods. Plus, he's agreed to come to your house tomorrow with what sounds like evidence of their other crimes. What happens tomorrow? We'll have officers positioned around your neighborhood, and you'll be wearing the recording device again. If Marcus and Sienna bring documentation of their other thefts, we'll have enough evidence to arrest them for conspiracy, theft, and fraud. Are you ready for this to end tomorrow? I thought about Harold's Mustang sitting safely in my garage, about the other victims whose cars had been destroyed, about my grandson who'd somehow convinced himself that targeting elderly people was a legitimate business model. Detective Kim, I've been ready for this to end since last Sunday. Sunday morning, I attended Mass at St. Catherine's like always, but my prayers were different than usual. Instead of asking for strength to get through another week alone, I was asking for courage to see this through and wisdom to handle whatever happened with Marcus and Sienna. Father Rodriguez noticed my distraction during communion and squeezed my hand as he handed me the wafer. "Whatever burden you're carrying, Rose, you don't have to carry it alone," he said quietly. If only he knew that by this afternoon I'd either have helped the police arrest my grandson or become the target of 2 criminals who discovered I'd been working undercover. The recording device felt heavier than yesterday, a constant reminder of the choice I'd made to prioritize justice over family loyalty. At 1:30, Detective Kim called to confirm that surveillance units were in position around my neighborhood. "Mrs. Martinez, remember that your safety is our primary concern. If at any point you feel threatened or unsafe, use the code word we discussed and we'll intervene immediately." The code word was Harold, my late husband's name. If I mentioned Harold in conversation with Marcus and Sienna, officers would immediately enter my house. It felt appropriate, somehow, that Harold's name would be my lifeline in this situation. He'd always protected me when he was alive. Now his name would protect me from the grandson who'd forgotten what family loyalty actually meant. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard car door slam in my driveway. Through my new security cameras, I watched Marcus and Sienna approach my front door. Marcus was carrying a laptop bag and what looked like a folder full of documents. Sienna was carrying a professional-looking camera. They looked like legitimate business people arriving for a meeting, which I suppose was exactly the impression they cultivated with all their victims. I opened the door with what I hoped was a convincing smile. "Marcus, Sienna, come in. Can I get you anything to drink?" "Coffee would be great, Grandma," Marcus said, kissing my cheek like nothing had changed between us. Sienna followed him into the kitchen, already examining my surroundings with those calculating eyes I'd learned to recognize. "Mrs. Martinez," Sienna said as I poured coffee, "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding last Sunday. I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd really like to start over." Misunderstanding? Last Sunday's attempted theft had been reduced to a simple misunderstanding in her mind. "That's very kind of you to say, dear. I think we were all a little emotional." As we settled around my kitchen table, Marcus opened his laptop and pulled out the folder of documents. "Grandma, I want to show you exactly what Sienna and I have been working on. I think once you see the quality of our promotional materials and understand the financial benefits, you'll realize this is a legitimate business opportunity." The first thing he showed me was a professionally designed website called Classic Connections that featured photos of vintage cars with descriptions of their rental availability for film and photography projects. The cars were beautiful, the descriptions were detailed, and the rental prices were substantial. If I hadn't known better, I would have been impressed by their professionalism. "This is very sophisticated, Marcus. How long have you been developing this business?" "About 8 months," Sienna replied, leaning forward enthusiastically. "We started small, working with just a few car owners, but word of mouth has been amazing. Most of our clients are repeat customers now." Repeat customers. The victims whose cars had been stolen were being described as satisfied clients. The psychological compartmentalization was staggering. "Can you show me some examples of the work you've done with other clients?" I asked. Marcus scrolled through the laptop screen, showing me professional photographs of various classic cars in scenic locations. The 1965 Thunderbird that had ended up in a Nevada chop shop, the 1969 Mustang Boss that had been found stripped in Los Angeles. Each stolen vehicle was presented as a successful business collaboration. "These photos are beautiful," I said, and meant it. Whatever else they were doing, Marcus and Sienna were talented photographers. "What kind of financial arrangements do you typically make with the car owners?" Sienna asked, pulling out a folder full of what appeared to be contracts. "For a car like yours with its vintage appeal and excellent condition,
We'd probably start with a 60-40 split of rental income, with 60% going to you as the owner. She handed me a contract template that looked remarkably professional. Legal language about rental periods, insurance coverage, promotional rights, and revenue sharing. If I hadn't known these people were criminals, I would have been tempted to sign it. "This looks very thorough," I said, scanning the contract. "How do you handle insurance coverage during the rental periods?" "That's one of the benefits of working with us," Marcus said. "Our business insurance covers all vehicles during promotional use. You don't have to worry about any liability issues." Business insurance that covered stolen vehicles. I wondered if they'd actually purchased such insurance, or if this was just another lie they told victims to make them feel secure about handing over their cars. "Marcus, can you walk me through what happened with some of your other clients? I'd like to understand the process from start to finish." What followed was a 40-minute presentation that was essentially a confession to multiple felonies, delivered with the enthusiasm of a sales pitch. Marcus described how they identified potential victims through car show attendance and social media activity, how Sienna researched their personal situations to determine who lived alone and might be vulnerable to friendly attention from young people, how they approached victims with seemingly legitimate business proposals that gradually escalated into car borrowing arrangements. "The key," Sienna said, "is building genuine relationships with our clients. Most elderly car collectors are lonely and excited to share their passion with younger people who appreciate vintage automobiles. Once they trust us, they're usually happy to participate in mutually beneficial business arrangements." Building genuine relationships. She was describing the systematic manipulation of isolated elderly people as relationship building. The clinical precision of their targeting methodology was chilling.
What about the car owners who became unhappy with the arrangements? I asked. How do you handle those situations? Marcus and Sienna exchanged a quick glance before Marcus answered. Sometimes older people get confused about business agreements or have unrealistic expectations about timing. When that happens, we work with our insurance partners to resolve any disputes. Usually, everyone ends up satisfied with the outcome. Insurance partners who resolved disputes. The stolen vehicles that ended up in chop shops were being described as insurance settlements that satisfied unhappy clients. "I'm curious about your most recent client relationships," I said. "Can you give me some specific examples?" "Well," Sienna said, pulling out photographs, "we just finished a 3-month campaign with a Thunderbird owner in Riverside. Beautiful car, amazing photo opportunities, very profitable for everyone involved." She showed me professional photographs of the Thunderbird that I knew had been found stripped in a Nevada chop shop. According to Detective Kim, the owner had been devastated by its destruction, but here was Sienna describing it as a profitable business collaboration. What about the owner? Was he happy with how the campaign went? "Oh, absolutely," Marcus said. "In fact, he was so satisfied with the insurance settlement that he's referred several other collectors to us. That's how we knew your Mustang would be perfect for our California expansion." Referred other collectors. The victims whose cars had been stolen were supposedly referring new victims to their tormentors. The delusion was complete. Marcus and Sienna had convinced themselves that their crimes were actually successful business ventures that left everyone happy. "Speaking of California," I said, "what's your timeline for the move?" "We're hoping to leave tomorrow morning," Sienna said. "We've got several potential clients lined up in the Los Angeles area, and we want to get established before the peak wedding and film season starts." Tomorrow morning. They were planning to leave town immediately, probably before the police could build cases against them for the other thefts. This meeting was their last attempt to secure my Mustang before fleeing the state. "Tomorrow seems very soon," I said. "If I agreed to let you use my car, how would the logistics work?" Marcus leaned forward eagerly. "It's actually perfect timing, Grandma. We'd take the Mustang with us to California, use it for promotional shoots while we're getting established, and start sending you rental income within the first month. By the time we're ready to return it, you'll probably have earned more money than the car is currently worth." By the time they were ready to return it, there would be nothing left to return except maybe a stripped frame in some criminal garage. The casualness with which he lied to my face was breathtaking. "That sounds very appealing," I said, "but I have to ask, what happens if something goes wrong? What if the car is damaged or stolen while you have it?" "That's why we have comprehensive insurance coverage," Sienna said. "If anything happens to your car while it's in our custody, the insurance settlement would probably be more than you could get if you tried to sell it privately." Insurance settlements that exceeded the car's value. They were openly describing insurance fraud as a benefit of working with them. I have to admit, you've presented this very professionally, I said, but I'm still a little nervous about letting my car leave the state. It has a lot of sentimental value. Grandma, Marcus said, reaching across to take my hand, I understand your attachment to the car, but Harold would have wanted you to make practical financial decisions, not hold on to things for purely emotional reasons. This is a chance to honor his memory while also securing your financial future. Harold would have wanted me to make practical financial decisions. My grandson was using my dead husband's memory to manipulate me into handing over the car Harold had given me as a symbol of love and independence. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. You know what, Marcus? You're right about Harold. He always told me to be practical and make smart financial choices. I stood up from the table, ostensibly to get more coffee, but actually to create some distance before I said what I needed to say. Harold would have wanted me to call the police the moment I realized my own grandson was trying to steal from me. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and Sienna stared at me with identical expressions of confusion and growing alarm. Grandma, Marcus said slowly, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you've just spent 40 minutes confessing to multiple felonies while I recorded every word. I touched the recording device through my shirt. Insurance fraud, theft, targeting elderly victims, systematic criminal enterprise. Should I continue? Sienna was the first to react, jumping up from her chair so quickly she knocked over her coffee cup. You crazy old witch! You set us up! Sienna, I said calmly, you and Marcus set yourselves up when you decided that stealing from elderly people was a legitimate business model. Marcus was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the charming grandson, not the manipulative con artist, but something cold and calculating that made my chest tight with fear. Grandma, you have no idea what you've just done. I've just helped the police build cases against 2 criminals who have been terrorizing elderly car collectors for months. What I don't understand, Marcus, is how Elena's son turned into someone who would target his own grandmother for theft. You don't understand anything, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. You're a lonely old woman who couldn't stand to see me succeed. You'd rather destroy your own family than admit that maybe, just maybe, you don't need to control everything around you anymore. The accusation stung because it echoed the things he'd said to other family members, the narrative he'd constructed to justify his criminal behavior. But I wasn't going to let him manipulate me into feeling guilty for protecting myself and other victims. Marcus, success doesn't come from stealing other people's treasured possessions. Success comes from working hard and building something legitimate. Your mother understood that. I thought I'd raised you to understand it too. Don't you dare talk about my mother, Marcus snapped. She's dead because she worked herself to death trying to live up to your impossible standards. Well, I'm not going to make that mistake. The words hit me like physical blows. Marcus blamed me for Elena's death, blamed my work ethic and my expectations for the cancer that had taken my daughter. The psychological damage went deeper than I realized. Marcus, I said softly, your mother didn't die because she worked hard. She died because cancer is cruel and unpredictable and unfair. And she would be heartbroken to know that you've chosen to honor her memory by becoming a criminal. Shut up, Sienna hissed. Just shut up, you manipulative old bitch. Marcus, we need to get out of here right now. But Marcus wasn't moving. He was staring at me with those cold eyes, and I suddenly realized that Detective Kim's warnings about escalation hadn't been theoretical. These weren't just thieves who would slink away when caught. They were criminals who felt cornered and desperate, and I was alone in my kitchen with both of them. Marcus, I said carefully, Sienna's right. You should leave now. Both of you should just walk away and never contact me again. Walk away? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Grandma, you just destroyed everything Sienna and I have been working toward. You think we're going to just walk away and let you ruin our lives? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Whatever was going to happen next, I knew it wasn't going to end with them simply leaving. I needed to use the code word, needed to bring the police into my house immediately.
But I also needed to be careful about how I did it, because Marcus and Sienna were both standing between me and all the exits. You know what, Marcus? I think Harold would be proud of me for standing up to bullies, even when they're family. As soon as I said Harold's name, I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. The front door burst open before Marcus could react. Detective Kim entered first, her weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor, followed by 3 uniformed officers who immediately positioned themselves to control the room. "Police! Everyone remain calm and keep your hands visible." Marcus spun toward the sound, his face cycling through shock, rage, and resignation in the space of seconds. Sienna backed toward the kitchen window as if she was considering jumping through it, but Officer Rodriguez moved smoothly to block her path. "Marcus Torres and Sienna Walsh, you're under arrest," Detective Kim announced, her voice professionally steady. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is harassment!" Sienna shrieked, her polished composure finally cracking completely. "She's a vindictive old woman who set us up because she's jealous of our success. This is elder abuse, and I want a lawyer right now." Detective Kim continued reading them their rights while the uniformed officers moved to handcuff both suspects. Marcus didn't resist, but his eyes never left mine. The look he gave me was filled with such hatred that I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself. "Grandma," he said as Officer Martinez secured the handcuffs around his wrists, "you think you've won something here, but you've just destroyed the last family you had left. Carmen will never forgive you for this. None of them will." His words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. The thought of losing Carmen, of having the entire family turn against me for having Marcus arrested, made my chest tight with anxiety. But then I remembered the photographs Detective Kim had shown me. The stripped Mustang frame in Los Angeles, the Thunderbird parts scattered across a Nevada chop shop floor, the elderly victims who'd trusted these criminals and lost treasured possessions that could never be replaced. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy our family. You did that when you decided to become a criminal. And if the rest of the family can't understand the difference between love and enabling, then maybe they were never really my family to begin with." Sienna was still ranting as the officers led her toward the door. "This is all your fault, Marcus. I told you we should have just taken the damn car that first day instead of trying to be nice about it. Old people always make everything complicated." The casual admission that they'd considered simply stealing the car without any pretense of permission was chilling. If Mrs. Patterson hadn't been watching from her window that night, if I hadn't installed security cameras, they might have succeeded in taking the Mustang while I slept. Detective Kim remained behind after the other officers had loaded Marcus and Sienna into separate patrol cars. She helped me turn off the recording device and walked me through what would happen next. "Mrs. Martinez, you did extraordinary work today. The recorded confessions we obtained will be crucial evidence in prosecuting not just your case, but the other thefts as well. You probably saved several other elderly collectors from becoming victims." I sank into Harold's old recliner, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. "Detective, what happens to Marcus now?" "He and Ms. Walsh will be charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Given the interstate nature of their crimes and the amount of money involved, they're looking at significant federal charges as well. If convicted on all counts, they could each face 10 to 15 years in prison." 10 to 15 years. Marcus would be nearly 40 by the time he was released, if he served the full sentence. The magnitude of how completely he'd destroyed his future was staggering. "Will I have to testify at their trial?" "Yes, but you won't be alone. We've already contacted the other victims, and several have agreed to testify as well. The elderly gentleman from Riverside whose Thunderbird was destroyed wants to thank you personally for stopping them before they could hurt anyone else."
The thought of meeting other victims, of hearing their stories and sharing our experiences was both comforting and heartbreaking. We would form an accidental community bound together by the betrayal of young people we'd trusted. Detective Kim, can I ask you something? Do you think Marcus really believed his own lies about this being a legitimate business, or did he know all along that he was stealing from elderly people? She considered the question carefully before answering. In my experience, Mrs. Martinez, people like your grandsons start with small compromises and gradually convince themselves that bigger crimes are justified. I think Marcus began by telling himself he was borrowing cars with permission, then convinced himself that keeping them longer was acceptable, then decided that selling them was just good business sense. By the time he was actively targeting elderly collectors, he'd built an entire belief system that made him the hero of his own story. That made sense in a terrible way. Marcus hadn't woken up one morning and decided to become a criminal who preyed on elderly people. He'd made a series of increasingly bad decisions, each one justified by the previous compromise, until he was so far from his original moral compass that stealing from his own grandma seemed reasonable. What about Sienna? What's her background? Ms. Walsh is a different story. We've found evidence suggesting she's been running various scams since she was a teenager. Identity theft, credit card fraud, fake charity campaigns. She's the one who developed the methodology for targeting elderly car collectors through social media research. Your grandson was just her most recent partner in crime. So Marcus hadn't been the mastermind of their criminal enterprise. He'd been manipulated by someone even more experienced in deception than he was. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped me understand how a grieving young man who'd lost his mother might have been recruited into a life of crime by someone who specialized in manipulating vulnerable people. After Detective Kim left, I sat alone in my kitchen, looking at the coffee cups and documents scattered across the table where Marcus and Sienna had just confessed to multiple felonies. The house felt different now, like something fundamental had shifted in its atmosphere. This had been my safe space for 47 years, but now it would always be the place where I helped arrange the arrest of my own grandson.
The phone started ringing around 6 o'clock. First, Carmen, calling from the hospital where she worked. Grandma Rose, what's happening? Someone from Marcus's apartment complex called me and said police arrested him at your house this afternoon. I'd been dreading this conversation, but Carmen deserved to hear the truth from me rather than getting a distorted version from someone else. I told her everything, from the initial attempt to take the car to the undercover recording operation that had led to Marcus and Sienna's arrest. Carmen was quiet for a long time after I finished. Finally, she said, "Grandma Rose, I'm so sorry. I knew Marcus was struggling, but I had no idea he'd gotten involved in anything like this. Are you okay? Are you safe?" The relief in her voice when she realized I was the victim rather than the villain in this situation almost made me cry. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Shaken up, but fine. The police were very professional, and Detective Kim thinks this will help them solve several other similar crimes. "What can I do to help? Do you need me to come over tonight?" The offer was tempting, but I knew Carmen was working double shifts to pay for nursing school, and she needed her rest more than I needed company. "I'll be all right tonight, honey, but maybe we could have lunch tomorrow? I could use some time with family who actually loves me." "Of course, Grandma Rose. And Grandma, you did the right thing. I know it was hard, but Marcus was hurting people. Someone had to stop him." The next call was from Patricia, Elena's younger sister, and it didn't go as well. "Rose, what the hell did you do? Marcus is in jail because of you. He's family, for Christ's sake. How could you betray your own grandson like that?" I'd expected this reaction from Patricia, who'd always believed that family loyalty meant overlooking bad behavior rather than confronting it. "Patricia, Marcus was stealing cars from elderly people. He tried to steal my car,
Would you have preferred I let him get away with it? He's grieving, Rose. He lost his mother 3 years ago, and instead of helping him through it, you had him arrested. Elena would be ashamed of you. The accusation that Elena would be ashamed of me was designed to wound, and it succeeded. But as I thought about my daughter, I realized Patricia was wrong. Elena had raised her children to be honest and hardworking, just as I'd raised her. She would have been heartbroken by Marcus's crimes, but she would have supported my decision to stop him from hurting other people. Patricia, Elena taught Marcus right from wrong. She would be devastated to learn that he'd chosen to ignore those lessons, but she wouldn't want me to enable his criminal behavior just because he's family. You're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see young people succeed, Patricia snapped. Marcus was trying to build something, and you destroyed it because you're jealous that he doesn't need you anymore. The conversation ended with Patricia hanging up on me, but her words echoed what Marcus had said during his arrest. I was being portrayed as a jealous old woman who'd sabotaged my grandson's success out of spite. The narrative was appealing because it cast Marcus as a victim rather than a criminal, but it also revealed how effectively he'd manipulated other family members into believing his version of events. Over the next week, I received similar calls from other relatives who'd heard Patricia's version of the story. Marcus's father, who'd abandoned him after Elena's death, suddenly emerged to criticize my parenting methods. Distant cousins who barely knew me felt qualified to lecture me about the importance of family forgiveness. Even Elena's old friends from high school called to express their disappointment in my treatment of her son. The isolation was painful, but it also clarified something important for me. The family members who truly loved me were the ones asking if I was okay and whether I needed support. The relatives who criticized me were the same people who'd been absent during Elena's illness, who'd never offered to help with Marcus and Carmen after their mother died, who'd been content to let me carry the emotional and financial burden of raising grieving children while they went on with their own lives. Carmen visited me every day that week, bringing groceries and staying for dinner. She'd spoken with her brother's public defender and learned more details about the charges he was facing. Grandma Rose, they found evidence linking Marcus and Sienna to at least 7 different car thefts across 3 states. The FBI is getting involved because they crossed state lines. This is much bigger than just what they tried to do to you. 7 different car thefts? At least 7 other elderly people who trusted these criminals and lost treasured possessions? The scope of their crimes was even worse than I had initially understood. Carmen, do you think Marcus really didn't understand that he was hurting people, or was he just good at lying to himself about it? She was quiet for a moment, picking at her food. I think he started believing his own lies. After Mom died, Marcus got really bitter about how hard she worked and how little she had to show for it. He started talking about how the system was rigged against people like us, how successful people got ahead by taking advantage of others. I think Sienna found someone who was already angry at the world and convinced him that stealing from wealthy people was some kind of justice. That explanation resonated with something Detective Kim had said about criminals who build belief systems to justify their behavior. Marcus hadn't started as a sociopath who enjoyed hurting elderly people. He'd started as a grieving young man who felt the world owed him something, and he'd been recruited by someone who knew how to exploit that vulnerability. Have you seen him since the arrest? I went to the jail yesterday. He's different, Grandma Rose. Angry in a way I've never seen before. He blames you for everything that's happened. Says you destroyed his life because you couldn't stand to see him succeed. He asked me to try to convince you to drop the charges. The request was predictable, but it still stung. Even after being caught red-handed committing multiple felonies, Marcus still believed he was the victim in this situation. What did you tell him? I told him that you didn't press charges. The police arrested him based on evidence of crimes he committed against other people.
I told him that if he'd spent half as much energy on legitimate work as he did on criminal schemes, he could have built a real business and made Mom proud, instead of ending up in federal prison. 2 weeks after the arrest, Detective Kim called to update me on the investigation. Marcus and Sienna had been indicted on federal charges, and their trial was scheduled for 6 months away. More importantly, the evidence we'd gathered had helped solve several other cases and led to the arrest of additional members of their criminal network. Mrs. Martinez, I wanted you to know that the gentleman from Riverside whose Thunderbird was destroyed has asked to meet you.
His name is Robert Chen, and he says he'd like to thank you personally for stopping these people before they could hurt anyone else. Meeting another victim was both appealing and daunting. I wanted to connect with someone who understood what I'd experienced, but I also wasn't sure I was ready to hear the details of how Marcus and Sienna had manipulated and betrayed him. Would it be possible to arrange a meeting somewhere neutral, maybe a coffee shop or restaurant? Detective Kim set up a meeting at a quiet cafe downtown the following Saturday. Robert Chen was a soft-spoken man in his late 70s who walked with a slight limp and carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd overcome significant challenges. His handshake was firm, and his eyes were kind but sad. Mrs. Martinez, I can't thank you enough for what you did. When Detective Kim told me that your own grandson was involved, I realized how much courage it must have taken to call the police. We spent 2 hours sharing our stories. Robert's Thunderbird had been his deceased wife's favorite car, the one they'd driven on their honeymoon and countless weekend trips over 35 years of marriage. When Marcus and Sienna had approached him with their photography proposal, he'd been excited to share memories of his wife and the adventures they'd had in that car. They were so charming, so interested in the car's history. The young woman took beautiful photographs of me standing beside it, said she was documenting classic cars and the stories behind them. When they asked to borrow it for additional photos at scenic locations, I was flattered that they thought it was special enough to feature in their project. The manipulation had been identical to what they'd attempted with me. Building relationships with isolated elderly people, showing interest in their possessions and memories, gradually escalating requests until the victims found themselves handing over valuable assets to criminals they'd mistaken for friends. Robert, did you suspect anything was wrong before they disappeared with your car? There were small things that didn't quite add up. The young man claimed to be a professional photographer, but he didn't know basic technical terms. The woman said she was a social media influencer, but when I looked up her accounts, most of her followers seemed fake. But I wanted to believe they were legitimate because they made me feel like my car and my memories mattered to someone. That was the cruelest part of their method. They didn't just steal valuable possessions. They exploited the loneliness and desire for connection that many elderly people experience, using genuine human needs to facilitate criminal behavior. When did you realize you'd been scammed? When they didn't return the car after the agreed-upon week, I started calling the number they'd given me. It went straight to voicemail every time. Then I tried to find their photography business online and discovered that all their websites had been taken down. That's when I knew I'd been robbed. The systematic nature of their deception was staggering. Fake websites, false identities, carefully crafted backstories designed to build trust with vulnerable targets. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that required planning and coordination. Robert, how did you handle the emotional impact of being deceived by people you'd trusted? His expression grew thoughtful. That was almost harder than losing the car itself. The financial loss was significant, but the feeling of being fooled, of having my grief and loneliness used against me, that took months to get over. I stopped trusting people, stopped accepting social invitations, became suspicious of anyone who showed interest in my life or belongings. This was the lasting damage that Marcus and Sienna's crimes inflicted. Beyond the stolen property and financial losses,
They destroyed their victims' ability to trust, turning natural human connections into potential threats. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate crime. What helped you start trusting people again? Time, mostly, and therapy. I started seeing a counselor who specialized in elder abuse, and she helped me understand that being deceived didn't make me stupid or weak. These criminals are professionals who study human psychology and use sophisticated manipulation techniques. Anyone could fall victim to their methods. Professional manipulation techniques. It was a reminder that Marcus and Sienna weren't just opportunistic thieves, they were predators who'd studied how to exploit human vulnerabilities for profit. Robert, do you think my grandson really believed he was running a legitimate business? Or do you think he knew all along that he was committing crimes? Robert considered the question carefully. Mrs. Martinez, I think people can convince themselves of almost anything if the alternative is admitting they've become someone they never wanted to be. Your grandson probably started with small compromises and gradually built a belief system that justified bigger crimes. By the time he was actively targeting people like us, he'd convinced himself that we deserved to be robbed because we were wealthy enough to afford classic cars. Deserved to be robbed because we were wealthy enough to afford classic cars? The logic was twisted, but it explained how Marcus could target elderly people without feeling guilty about it. In his mind, we weren't victims. We were privileged people who'd been hoarding resources that younger, more deserving individuals could put to better use. Have you been following the case against them? Yes, Detective Kim keeps me informed about the legal proceedings. I plan to testify at their trial, assuming my health holds up. I want other potential victims to understand how these scams work and how to protect themselves. The trial was still 4 months away, but I was already dreading the experience of testifying against Marcus in open court. The thought of sitting in a witness box while my grandson's defense attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive old woman was terrifying. Robert, are you nervous about testifying? Terrified, he admitted with a wry smile, but also determined. These people destroyed something irreplaceable when they stole my wife's car. If my testimony helps prevent them from hurting other families, then facing my fears will be worth it. His courage was inspiring. Despite being in his late 70s and dealing with health issues, Robert was prepared to relive the trauma of being victimized in order to protect other potential targets. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch as the trial approached. Having another victim who understood what I'd experienced was more comforting than I'd expected. For the first time since Marcus's arrest, I felt like I wasn't carrying this burden alone. 3 months before the trial, Carmen brought me disturbing news. She'd received a call from Sienna's mother, who'd asked her to intercede on behalf of both defendants. Mrs. Walsh claims that Marcus and Sienna are just kids who made mistakes, and that sending them to prison will ruin their lives. She wanted me to convince her to ask for leniency at their sentencing. The ask was audacious. The mother of one of the criminals was asking the sister of the other criminal to pressure the victim into showing mercy for people who had shown no mercy to their targets. Carmen, what did you tell her? I told her that Marcus is 24 years old and Sienna is 22. They're not children, and systematic theft isn't a mistake. I told her that if she wanted to help her daughter, she should encourage her to take responsibility for her crimes instead of trying to manipulate the victims into requesting lighter sentences. Carmen's response had been perfect, but the fact that these criminals' families were trying to pressure us into showing leniency revealed how little they understood about the seriousness of the charges. In their minds, this was still just a family dispute that could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Marcus himself, written from the federal detention center where he was awaiting trial.
The letter was several pages long and filled with justifications, accusations, and demands that I reconsider my testimony. Grandma Rose, the letter began, I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. Because of your vindictive decision to involve the police in a simple family disagreement, Sienna and I are facing decades in prison. Our lives are ruined, our futures are destroyed, and our families are suffering. I hope you can live with the consequences of your actions. The letter went on to describe me as a bitter old woman who'd called the police out of jealousy rather than genuine concern for other victims. Marcus claimed that their business had been completely legitimate, that they'd never stolen anything from anyone, and that I'd misinterpreted their conversations because I was desperate for attention and drama. If you have any love left for me, any respect for Mom's memory, you'll tell the prosecutor that you want to drop the charges. Tell them you were confused and scared and that you never intended for things to go this far. It's not too late to save what's left of our family. The manipulation was as brazen as it was ineffective. Even from jail, facing federal charges, Marcus was still trying to convince me that I was the villain in the situation, and that rescuing him from the consequences of his crimes was my responsibility as his grandmother. I showed the letter to Detective Kim, who read it with professional interest. Mrs. Martinez, this kind of communication from defendants to victims is more common than you might think. It's essentially a continuation of the manipulation tactics they used to commit their crimes in the first place. The fact that your grandson is still trying to control your behavior from jail suggests he hasn't accepted responsibility for his actions. Should I respond to the letter? I'd recommend against it. Any communication between you and the defendants could be used by their defense attorneys to suggest ongoing family drama rather than criminal behavior. It's better to let the legal process proceed without getting drawn into personal negotiations. The trial began on a cold February morning 6 months after Marcus and Sienna's arrest. The federal courthouse was imposing, with marble columns and high ceilings that made everyone inside look small and vulnerable. I'd worn my best dress and Harold's wedding ring, drawing strength from the symbol of our partnership and the reminder that he would have supported my decision to seek justice. Carmen accompanied me to the courthouse and sat in the gallery during my testimony. Robert Chen was there as well, along with 3 other elderly victims who traveled from different states to testify about their experiences with Marcus and Sienna's criminal enterprise. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, was a serious woman in her 40s who'd specialized in elder abuse cases for over a decade. She'd prepared me thoroughly for my testimony, explaining how the defense attorneys would try to portray me as a confused old woman who'd misunderstood my grandson's intentions. Mrs. Martinez, remember that your recorded conversations with the defendants speak for themselves. The defense can try to create doubt about your motivations for cooperating with law enforcement, but they can't argue with Marcus's own words describing their criminal methodology. When I was called to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than I'd expected. The courtroom was full of people, including several reporters who'd been following the case, but my eyes went immediately to Marcus and Sienna at the defense table. Marcus looked older than his 24 years, pale and thin in an orange jumpsuit that made him look more like a child playing dress-up than a hardened criminal. Sienna sat beside him, her platinum hair now showing dark roots, her expression sullen and defiant. For just a moment, looking at Marcus's face, I felt a wave of doubt. This was Elena's son, the little boy I'd comforted after nightmares and taught to ride a bicycle. Was I really prepared to testify against him in federal court, knowing that my words might send him to prison for over a decade? Then I remembered Robert Chen's destroyed Thunderbird, the stripped Mustang frame in Los Angeles, the systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly people who trusted these criminals with their most treasured possessions. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The prosecution's questioning was straightforward. They walked me through the timeline of events, from Marcus's initial request to borrow the car to the recorded conversations that revealed the scope of their criminal enterprise. The audio recordings were played for the jury, and hearing Marcus's voice describing elderly victims as confused and profitable was as chilling in the courtroom as it had been in my kitchen. When the defense attorney cross-examined me, he tried every tactic Detective Kim had warned me about.
Wasn't I a lonely widow desperate for attention? Hadn't I misunderstood my grandson's legitimate business proposal? Wasn't this really about my inability to accept that Marcus no longer needed my financial support? Mrs. Martinez, the defense attorney said, isn't it true that you called the police on your own grandson because you were angry that he was planning to move to California without your permission? I called the police because 2 people were loading their belongings into my car without my permission, and when I confronted them, they told me they were borrowing it forever. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft. But Marcus is your grandson. Didn't you think there might be a family solution to this disagreement that didn't involve criminal charges? There was a family solution. Marcus could have accepted my decision not to lend him the car and made other transportation arrangements. Instead, he chose to take it without permission. The defense attorney spent an hour trying to portray me as a vindictive old woman, but the recorded conversations undermined every argument he made. Marcus's own words describing their targeting methodology, their insurance fraud schemes, and their casual dismissal of elderly victims as confused made it impossible to argue that this had been a simple family misunderstanding. When I was finally dismissed from the witness stand, I felt drained but also relieved. I told the truth under oath, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change the facts of what Marcus and Sienna had done. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Other victims testified about their experiences, FBI agents presented evidence of the interstate criminal enterprise, and financial experts explained how the defendants had laundered stolen money through fake business accounts. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus himself. Against his attorney's advice, he'd insisted on testifying in his own defense, apparently believing he could charm the jury the way he'd charmed his victims. Instead, his testimony revealed the depth of his self-delusion and his complete lack of remorse for the harm he had caused. Quote, "These weren't thefts, these were mutually beneficial business arrangements. The car owners were happy to participate in our promotional campaigns, and everyone benefited financially." Mr. Torres, the prosecutor asked during cross-examination, how did the elderly gentleman from Riverside benefit financially when his Thunderbird was found stripped in a Nevada chop shop? That was an unfortunate outcome that wasn't part of our business plan. Sometimes things happen that are beyond your control. Things happen, Mr. Torres. Your accomplice, Miss Walsh, sold that man's car to a criminal organization that dismantled it for parts. How is that beyond your control? We had comprehensive insurance that was supposed to cover situations like that. You mean the insurance fraud you committed by filing false claims on stolen vehicles? Marcus's testimony went on for hours, and with each answer, he revealed more clearly that he still didn't understand the difference between legitimate business and criminal activity. Even facing federal charges, sitting in a courtroom where his victims had described the devastation his crimes had caused, he maintained that he was the real victim in this situation. Sienna's testimony was even worse. She claimed that all the criminal activity had been Marcus's idea, that she'd been manipulated into participating by an older man who'd taken advantage of her youth and naivete. Her attempt to portray herself as another victim fell apart when the prosecutor played recordings of her researching potential targets and bragging about her ability to identify elderly people through social media. Quote, "Miss Walsh, you described elderly car collectors as easy marks who were desperate for attention from young people. Does that sound like someone who was being manipulated into criminal behavior?"
That's not what I meant. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus and Sienna were convicted of theft, fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and money laundering. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Carmen and I sat in the courthouse cafe after the verdict, both of us emotionally exhausted by the experience. Grandma Rose, how are you feeling about all this? Sad, I said honestly. Relieved that it's over, but sad that it had to happen at all. Marcus threw away his future for money that was never really his to begin with. Do you regret calling the police that first day? I thought about the question carefully. The past 8 months had been the most difficult of my life since Harold's death. I'd lost relationships with family members, endured months of legal proceedings, and watched my grandson's life collapse in federal court. But I also thought about Robert Chen and the other victims whose cars had been destroyed.
about the potential future victims who would be spared because Marcus and Sienna were no longer free to target vulnerable elderly people. No, I said finally, I don't regret it. I regret that Marcus made choices that forced me to choose between protecting him and protecting other innocent people. But given that choice, I made the right decision. At the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, both Marcus and Sienna received 12-year federal prison sentences. The judge noted that their crimes had targeted some of society's most vulnerable members, and that their lack of remorse made rehabilitation unlikely without significant incarceration. Mr. Torres and Miss Walsh, the judge said, you preyed upon elderly individuals who trusted you, exploiting their loneliness and their desire for human connection to facilitate systematic theft. Your crimes caused not just financial harm, but lasting psychological damage to victims who may never again feel safe trusting strangers. The sentences I'm imposing reflect the seriousness of your crimes and the need to protect the public from further predation. Marcus stared at me throughout the sentencing hearing, his expression a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Even after being convicted by a jury and facing 12 years in federal prison, he seemed unable to accept that his actions had consequences, or that I wasn't somehow responsible for his situation. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he called out to me one last time. Grandma, I hope you're happy now. You got what you wanted. What I wanted was my grandson back. The sweet boy who'd helped me plant Doritos and learn to change the oil in Harold's Mustang. What I got was justice for the victims of 2 criminals who happened to share my DNA. After the sentencing, Detective Kim walked me to my car. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that your courage in this case helped us shut down a criminal enterprise that had victimized at least a dozen elderly people across multiple states. The investigation your case sparked led to additional arrests and the recovery of several stolen vehicles. Detective, do you think Marcus will ever understand what he did wrong? Prison changes people in different ways. Some inmates use the time to reflect on their crimes and work toward genuine rehabilitation. Others become more bitter and blame everyone except themselves for their situation. Your grandson's reaction during the trial suggests he's not ready to accept responsibility yet. But 12 years is a long time. People can change. People can change. I hoped she was right, but I also knew that expecting Marcus to transform into someone capable of remorse and empathy might be unrealistic. The manipulation and self-justification I'd witnessed during his trial suggested psychological damage that would take more than incarceration to repair. 1 year after Marcus's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed Carmen's number, but the voice on the other end was Marcus, calling from federal prison. Grandma Rose? Please don't hang up. I only get a few minutes and there's something I need to say. My first instinct was to end the call immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. Marcus, why are you calling? I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past year, about Mom, about the choices I made, about what I put you through. I need you to know that I understand now. What Sienna and I did was wrong. We hurt innocent people and we hurt our own family. The admission was so unexpected that I had to sit down. For 2 years, Marcus had maintained that he was the victim of circumstances and vindictive prosecution. Hearing him acknowledge his crimes was startling. Marcus, what changed your mind? I met another inmate whose grandmother was scammed by people like us. He told me about how destroyed she was, how she stopped trusting anyone, and became afraid to leave her house. Hearing him describe what those criminals did to someone he loved made me realize that's exactly what Sienna and I were doing to people like you. The parallel wasn't lost on me. It had taken meeting another victim's family member for Marcus to understand the impact of his crimes on the people he'd targeted. Grandma Rose, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I destroyed our relationship and hurt people who didn't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I finally understand why you called the police that day. You were protecting innocent people from criminals, and the fact that one of those criminals was your grandson doesn't make what you did wrong. The conversation lasted only a few more minutes before the call time expired, but it left me with mixed emotions. Relief that Marcus finally understood the gravity of his actions, but also sadness that it had taken a year in federal prison for him to develop the empathy he should have learned as a child. Carmen visited me that evening to discuss Marcus's call. "Grandma Rose, do you think he's genuinely changed, or is this just another manipulation attempt?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope it's genuine, but I've learned not to trust Marcus's words without seeing consistent changes in his behavior. 12 years is a long time. If he's really committed to rehabilitation, there will be plenty of opportunities to demonstrate it." 2 years later, I still live in the same house, still drive Harold's Mustang to Mass every Sunday, still tend my garden and maintain my independence. The security cameras remain active, and I'm more cautious about unexpected visitors than I used to be. But I haven't let fear or cynicism dominate my daily life. Carmen graduated from nursing school and now works at the same hospital where she did her training. She visits me twice a week, and we've developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation. She's dating a young doctor who treats me with genuine kindness rather than the calculating charm I learned to recognize in Marcus. Robert Chen and I have become friends, meeting monthly for coffee and comparing notes about our recovery from being victimized. He started dating a widow from his church, and his renewed trust in people gives me hope. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just given Marcus the car keys that first Sunday. Would he and Sienna have eventually stopped their criminal activities, or would they have escalated until someone got seriously hurt? I'll never know, but I sleep peacefully knowing I chose to protect innocent people rather than enable family dysfunction. The Mustang still runs beautifully, and every Sunday drive reminds me that standing up for what's right sometimes requires making the hardest choices of your life.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.